When you're thinking about buying a new GPU, a lot of times you'll look up reviews of them, you'll see a stack of a whole bunch of GPUs with a relative percentage, and that's fantastic for at a glance comparing the relative strength of a whole bunch of GPUs. The best ones will even have 1% lows included, all of that. However, what does that really mean in practice? Because in reality, it usually doesn't actually mean you'll get that many more frames. Because what you'll actually do is reduce graphic settings to reach your frame rate target. And so really it has more of an impact on image quality and resolution and frame rate, but it's not just an easy, it's this % frame rate difference. So in this video, I'm gonna look at 3 GPUs. We're gonna look at the RX 6600, which as of the time of filming, you can find pretty easily for around $330. We're gonna look at the RX 6700 XT, which as of the time of filming is in stock for a little bit over $500, although on Thursdays, you can check AMD Direct on their website, and I was able to score the reference model for the MSRP of $479. And then I'm also going to look at the RX 6800 XT, which you can find around $850. If you get really lucky, you might get it direct from AMD at $650 MSRP, I think it is. However, that one's much harder to get from AMD Direct. They sell out a lot quicker. Anyway, so what we're really going to look at here is at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K, what sort of graphic settings would you actually use, and what sort of frame rates do we actually reach at those targets? I think I'll throw in ray tracing quickly, but as we know on AMD cards, that could be a bit questionable, but I will throw it in there. Now, as far as what games we're going to test here, for me it was important to have a game that offered a side-by-side benchmark, so a built-in benchmark. It was graphically demanding, featured things like FSR built into it, as well as ray tracing support. And so I've decided to use Cyberpunk as our primary example that we'll look at, although we will also look a little bit at Red Dead Redemption 2, which doesn't feature FSR, but that might give us a chance to look at RSR on the RX 6600 if we need it. Now, the test system here is my R9 5950X with 32 gigabytes of 3600 CL16 RAM. And you can look at my full system specs in the description. All of my cards were run at their default out-of-the-box settings. So I didn't overclock any of them, although I think certain models here, like the 6800 XT Tough version, might have a small factory overclock. Anyway, we're just looking at them out of the box. Now, one last little thing. If you notice that some of the footage might look a little bit darker or the color's a bit different on some of the captures, I'm running a really small channel here. Some of these things I captured on different days, and then I put them all together. At the time, it was always on the latest graphics drivers, but these were not all captured on the same graphics driver just due to the time it took to capture all of this and always being on the latest at the time of filming. And there was a recent graphics driver where I think the AMD encoder did use a darker setting than on the other ones. So don't get thrown off too far by that. All of these were being recorded, by the way, using their own GPU encoder. And I'm pretty sure I had them all at the same settings and all of that. So actually, native performance without any recording overhead might even be a couple FPS higher, although it really is usually a pretty minor difference. Let's jump right into the recordings of the benchmarks. I'll give you my thoughts and then some final thoughts at the end. So at 1080p, the setting that I would actually use on each of these is the high settings on the 6600. Although it's very playable at ultra, going down to high has very little visual impact, but does help keep the frame rate, even the minimums, to just barely ever dip below 60. Whereas on the 6700 XT and the 6800 XT, I think we can go all the way up to ultra, although going down to high allows even higher FPS experiences if that's what you're looking for. Now, these were recorded on different drivers, and I think that's why some of the darkness levels, the brightness levels, I think are set a bit differently here. And you'll probably see that throughout the benchmarks. Also apologize that the MSI Afterburner size that I used at 1080p was designed for split screening 2 things side by side, not 3 things side by side. So it is cutting off a little bit of our clock speeds and things like that. Apologies on that, but we can definitely say that all 3 GPUs can deliver a good experience at 1080p, although high refresh rate, yeah. Anyway, if we're going to 1440p, the 6600, I would go down to the medium settings or use FSR at the ultra quality or both. In this case, I'm just doing native resolution with medium, and I think it's fine. The 6700 XT can play at ultra, although at high settings, we can see here, helps keep it above 60 a lot more frequently. And the 6800 XT, we can go ahead and use ultra settings, no problem. Although going down to the high settings would make it a high refresh rate experience. It's already well above 60, but I mean, you can go way above 60 if you want to by just dropping to high from ultra. Although I think it's good enough here that I would probably just play at ultra. You know, the high settings are pretty tempting though. All of them, I think, delivering an absolutely playable 1440p experience. So again, that's kind of the point of this video is, you know, like for like comparisons can be a bit misleading when you think about how good can a GPU do. I mean, is the visual quality that much difference between medium, high, and ultra? Now, what if we wanted to play at 4K? So the 6600, going down to medium settings and FSR balanced, actually gives a reasonable 4K frame rate, although obviously that's not true 4K using FSR. The 6700 XT, I thought going down to medium with FSR at ultra quality was a better compromise than high settings going down to quality, although that was another way we could have done it. I like high res, so keeping close to native to me is pretty important. The 6800 XT, I went down to high settings, FSR, ultra quality, and you know, I could have gone up to ultra and still done pretty well. I could have done you know, native at high, and it just dips below 60 a little bit more than I'd like here. So these are definitely, I think, very reasonable settings. And look, all of them can deliver a reasonable 4K experience. The 6600 is certainly not locking 60 FPS and is making a much bigger sacrifice on the image quality and the resolution. But yeah, I think they all did pretty well. Now, what about ray tracing? I think that what I tried to do here is reach any sort of playable ray tracing settings, which was honestly kind of difficult. We've got the 6600 needing FSR even at 1080p, but the reflections to me are the most meaningful visual change, so I chose to use those because there wasn't really any settings where I could do 60 FPS, and this could at least, you know, be above 30. The 6700 XT can actually do native 1080p with the ray tracing at the low settings, whereas at the 6800 XT, I think 1440p is a more reasonable target, and to do that, I had to use FSR Ultra Quality, which I do think looks pretty good at 1440p. And that did get us the ray traced reflections with a somewhat reasonable frame rate. Although on all of these GPUs, I think my personal preference would be to just turn off ray tracing. I tried to arrive at least a somewhat reasonable ray tracing choice for each of them to showcase here. I just, yeah, I don't think it's really worth it for the frame rate hit on any of them. Okay. But what if we actually do some like-for-like comparisons? So if you did just run all of them at 1080p Ultra, we can see that the 6600 is playable, although it certainly dips below 60 in these more demanding scenes, whereas the 6700 XT and the 6800 XT don't really have any issues. And they're, you know, all delivering very, very reasonable frame rates. But again, this is where I just feel like the like-for-like comparisons hide so much. When you just look at the percentage difference in performance, when you actually look at the experience you would get when playing the game, a lot of times the more budget mid-range cards can really do just fine if you're not obsessed with locking everything to Ultra. Although, again, at 1080p here, the 6600 is doing fine at Ultra. I just think it makes a lot more sense to go down to the high settings to stay above 60 FPS pretty much all the time, and frequently well above 60 FPS. So yeah, that would be my personal preferences here. But anyway, seeing the like-for-like comparison still has its uses, and you can see the averages there as well. So again, 1440p, I think this is further accentuating the challenges of looking at just like-for-like comparisons, where if you just benchmark every GPU at the same resolution and settings, yeah, we see how they stack up against each other, but you wouldn't really use the 6600 at these settings. It just doesn't make any sense for 1440p. When we saw that going down to the medium settings still looked pretty good and was able to deliver a pretty close to 60 FPS experience. Here we're seeing how the 6700 XT does with the ultra settings in Cyberpunk, which are extremely demanding. We see that it doesn't quite lock 60 all the time, although I'm pretty sure our average at the end will be around 60. But that's again where I think averages, when you're just looking at bar graphs, do hide a lot of what's really going on. We can see that we're well below 60 a lot of the time, and averages tend to hide that, although at least people that show the 1% lows does help capture some of the, some of the experience. And of course, the 6800 XT doesn't really have any problems at Ultra 1440p. Again, the averages, yeah, do hide a lot. Now at 4K, if we just want to just put them all at the ultra settings, here you go. Even the 6800 XT is struggling at 4K ultra in this game. And before you go like, AMD can't play at 4K. Guys, a 3090 Ti can't handle this game at 4K ultra and actually still average 60 FPS. So it's not just AMD here. The ultra settings at 4K in this game are crazy. You can also see our 6600 is rendering at such a low frame rate that it's actually not even able to keep up in the benchmark. It's slowing down and getting out of sync with the other recordings. That's interesting, but hey, we'll just go ahead and leave it because why not? Now the 6700 XT, again, this makes it look like it can't be used as a budget 4K card, except we saw that if you are willing to sacrifice a little bit of the image quality, you can get a perfectly fine 4K experience, although obviously not as good as what we're getting on the other cards. There's our averages, and let's go ahead and let our 6600 finish the race, but not dwell on it. Okay, how about Red Dead Redemption 2? At 1080p, I think all of them can handle the maximum preset. Now, when I say maximum preset, I do mean maximum preset. I don't mean going into the custom settings and turning some things up. I just mean sliding favor quality all the way to the right-hand side. We can see the 6600 easily delivers a above 60 FPS average at the maximum preset, with the 6700 XT and the 6800 XT just giving you a high refresh rate and then really high refresh rate experience at 1080p. Again, the 6800 XT at 1080p, some people will buy it for a high refresh rate esports experience and then also play some single player games. So I think testing it out at 1080p isn't meaningless because some people do use it at 1080p. Again, I think they're using it more, primarily esports, but that doesn't mean you can't play some single player games maxed out when you have time. So there we go. I think they're all doing pretty well. We see the 6600 just dip a little below 60 at times. Now, if we go up to 1440p, I think the 6600 should use the hardware unboxed optimized settings, or at least something like that. If you haven't checked out the videos from Hardware Unboxed when this game came out, where they really went into depth with all the graphic settings, and man, this game has a lot of graphic settings, and they measured the performance of each one with its image quality, you can see here that it still looks pretty good with those settings. I think the 6700 XT, again, I think it's the different drivers where the brightness looked a little bit darker there, so don't look so much at that brightness difference. Again, apologies for not having time to fix that. But anyway, these settings really deliver quite good experience. Now, the 6700 XT and the 6800 XT can still easily max the game out here, although if you wanted a higher refresh rate experience at 1440p, you certainly could also use the hardware unboxed settings on those GPUs, but I just didn't really find it necessary here. And for me, that game feels good as long as you're around 60. So going up to 4K, the 6600, I ended up sticking with the hardware unboxed optimized settings, but then using RSR. This game doesn't have FSR, but I rendered up from 1440p using RSR, and it looks reasonably okay on my 4K screen. Obviously, it's a sacrifice to image quality, but hey, it's a 6600 at 4K, and it's delivering us, somewhat decent experience. The 6700 XT, actually, by the way, on the 6600 note, if I just use the hardware unboxed optimized settings at 4K native, it does deliver a 30-ish FPS experience, and some people could just lock to 30 if they wanted the native 4K. I just think personally I'd probably do some upscaling if it was me. The 6700 XT at the hardware unboxed optimized settings is close enough to 60 at 4K that I didn't feel the need to use any RSR or upscaling, although that's certainly an option. It felt pretty good in this game. This game, honestly, as long as I'm around 60, it's okay. All right, so what I was really happy to see here was that all three of these GPUs can actually offer decent gaming experiences, not just at 1080p, but even 1440p, and okay, the RX 6600 was struggling at 4K, but you could use it on a 4K screen. I just would absolutely not recommend purchasing it for that reason. So if you noticed, we can tune them to be around 60 FPS in all of both games that we tested, which are pretty graphically demanding, and at all of the resolutions. Like I said, though, you just take a hit to the visual quality. And on the higher end GPUs, you certainly can target much higher frame rates while still being at maximum or near maximum settings and higher resolutions. So what are you buying for your money? I think I'd say that if you're buying a mid-range, upper mid-range card like the 6700 XT right now, you're buying something that has solid performance at 1440p or at 1440p with near maximum settings, 60 FPS, sometimes higher. But in the next few years, as games get more demanding, I think you will start have to turning down the settings a little bit to stay at 60 FPS at 1440p. Whereas if you buy a card like the 6700 XT for 1080p, you have a lot more headroom and can probably survive another GPU generation before really having to start thinking about turning down settings or upgrading. The RX 6600 is already basically ultra settings at 1080p 60 FPS, but occasionally already having to tweak a few things down to high if you really want to stay at 60 FPS. Whereas you can easily tweak some settings to reach higher frame rates at 1080p or tweak things quite a bit to stay around 60 FPS at 1440p, and I think its only use case at 4K would just be more like, a lot of people have a gaming PC that's also hooked up to maybe a 4K TV where you might play from your couch. If you're playing from your couch on your 4K TV, sitting back at a distance, things like FSR or RSR are fantastic and can let you run the game at a lower resolution, get decent performance on the 6600, and be just fine. I just don't think you should buy it for that purpose. Now, if you go up to the high-end cards, like the 6800 XT, I think what you're getting here is, you're absolutely crushing insane esports frame rates, I guess, at 1080p, even maximum settings in demanding titles. And then at the 1440p, you're able to absolutely max out games with no issues, and you're still getting a high refresh rate experience. And then at 4K, it's going to be hit or miss whether you can run at 60 FPS maximum settings. In a lot of the more demanding titles, you'll either want to be using FSR ultra quality, dropping a few things down to high, or doing both. And then I'd imagine in the next GPU generation, honestly, you'll probably want to upgrade. But I think that's just where we're at with 4K gaming right now. It's still kind of a upgrade every generation resolution, because I think that most games, when they're targeting their graphics optimization, or lack thereof, in a lot of recent titles, I think they're looking at making sure that the higher end cards, like a 3080 or a 6800 XT, deliver a high refresh rate 1440p maxed experience and close to 60 FPS at 4K, but it's not always going to be locked. Sometimes you have to tweak it down, and that's where I think, your Halo products, like your 3090s, 3090 Ti, 6900 XT, that little bit of extra performance sometimes gets you from that 50 to that 60 or something like that, frame rate wise, but I really think if you want to play at 4K, it's going to be expensive, and you're probably going to be upgrading quite frequently unless you're willing to use a lot of image scaling or tweaking some settings. As we saw, even the 6700 XT or the 6600 can reach playable frame rates on a 4K screen. All right, I feel like I am rambling on quite a bit here, so I'm just going to be interested in seeing your thoughts in the comments section, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.